Dr. Nikki Cooley and Dr. Alistair Reid would like to welcome you to Lecture 1, An Introduction to Plant Physiology. This lecture is the first lecture of the subject Plant Physiology, which is a component of the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology degree offered at North Melbourne Institute of TAFE. Please visit our website www.nmit.edu.au for more information on either this subject or the other courses that we offer. We are going to discuss several things in this lecture today. We are going to start with an explanation of why we are studying plant physiology. We are then going to define plant physiology and describe how this subject will be taught, principally as a journey through the plant. We will examine the subject learning objectives and look at the recommended reading. I will describe how this subject will be assessed, and we will complete this lecture with a subject checklist. All agricultural systems are underpinned by plants. Whether this is directly by the growing of a crop or indirectly by the use of plants for, say, animal or fish feed, they are essential to this enterprise. In theory, in order to optimize your commercial outputs, say for the best wine or for the best beef production, understanding how a plant grows and develops will significantly contribute to your agricultural endeavors. This subject aims to explore the fascinating and complex world of plants and give you an in-depth understanding of how plants grow and develop. The content of this subject is evidence-based, where knowledge has been gained through research and experimentation. In this slide, we will look at how you can study for this subject. You have a total of 10 hours per week assigned to this subject, and using Moodle as your guide, you will start with Lecture 1 and follow the lectures in the specified order. Once you have completed each lecture, a quiz will follow. This will enable you to demonstrate your knowledge or highlight areas where you may need to review the information. We have observed that students who tend to pass this subject and do well in it use the provided quizzes as a learning aid. Each quiz passed will allow access to the next lecture. Where complex themes or theories are presented in this subject, some lectures will contain links to short videos. Past students have said how useful these have been in improving their understanding. Each lecture will be accompanied with a handout, a list of links to be used, and a selection of reading. Readings are an essential process and will be highlighted. There are readings that are not essential to passing this subject, but will allow in-depth knowledge if the student wishes to pursue. Experimentation will be conducted in 2 parts and allows concepts of plant physiology to be explored. The first set of experiments will be conducted in a DIY style. At the start of the subject, one of these experiments will be conducted on a wheat plant. You will be given a wheat plant and you will keep this alive throughout the experiment. This experimentation will be on carbohydrate partitioning. You will make observation throughout the experiment and write this experiment up at the end. The second stage of experiments will involve intensive workshops over 2 days. The proposed dates for these are in Teaching Week 8 on the 13th and the 14th of April 2013. So let us define plant physiology. Plant physiology is a wide scope of contents and can cross many disciplines. As a result, there are many definitions. For this purpose and the purpose of the subject, we are going to use the Tays and Zeiger definition of plant physiology that states it is the study of function encompassing the dynamic process of growth, metabolism, and reproduction in living plants. To investigate plant physiology, such disciplines as biochemistry, anatomy, genetics, biophysics, and molecular biology may be explored. The most basic of terminology in this subject is to define a plant. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a plant is a living organism which is typically growing in a permanent state, of the kind exemplified by trees, shrubs, herbs, grasses, ferns, and mosses, that absorbs water and inorganic substances through its roots, and synthesizing nutrients in its leaves by photosynthesis, using the green pigment chlorophyll. The image on the slide from the Glossary of Herbs by Plant Parts by Maple Tree iTunes is a basic image that identifies many of the plant organs. The principal anatomical parts that many of you will be already familiar with are the roots, shoots, and leaves. If we start with the roots, you will see that there are principally two types of roots, primary and lateral roots. When these are examined in detail, you will see they contain root hairs. On these root hairs is a root tip and a root cap. The vascular tissues, which is a structure that's located predominantly in the stem, are where the xylem and the phloem are situated. The vascular tissues, xylem and phloem, are regarded as the transport mechanism of the plant. This is where water and nutrients are transported. The vascular tissues lead to the leaves. The leaves are the location for the very important process of photosynthesis, also called assimilation. This is where light energy is converted into chemical energy. We think of this chemical energy more typically as sugars. These sugars are transported around the plant and used immediately or as long-term energy stores. Plants also contain reproductive organs, illustrated here in the form of flowers and fruit structures. In the previous slide, the basic structure of a plant was reviewed. In this subject, understanding the function or a role of a plant is enhanced by observing the organs that aid this process. In your provided practical books, Practical 1 Plant Form and Function 1 and 2 gives you much more detail on this topic. Information can be found in this practical. After you have watched this lecture, please complete your first DIY practical. You will need to complete the associated tasks with the practical to complete all the information in this topic. To complete your studies on this topic, you are required to read the following 4 articles: A Botany for Gardeners, an Introduction and Guide, written by Brian Capon; the Tays and Zeiger 2010 Recommended Textbook, Chapter 1, on the topic of plant and cell architecture; the Plant Physiology Practical Handbook that comes with this subject, Practical 1 on Form and Function; and finally, the Reading in Tutorial 1 by Reinhard and Guzimai, Plant Architecture. The following article on plant architecture, a dynamic, multi-level and comprehensive approach to plant form, structure and onology, is a text that we recommend you read if you wish to gain in-depth knowledge in this topic. However, please note this article is not essential reading for this subject. In plant physiology, your journey through understanding the physiology of a plant will be conducted in 2 stages. The first stage will be an adventure through the plant. The second stage will be in-depth investigations into growth and development, plant defense, and nutrition, all components that are essential for commercial production of plants. So, let us look into more detail about how the journey through the plant and our lectures will be constructed. Lecture 1 will be an overview and an introduction of plant physiology. Then we will start at the roots. We will look at root structure and function. In Lecture 2 we will look at this specifically with respect to water, and in Lecture 3 we will look in detail about nutrient uptake. Both of these very important functional rules in plants and agriculture. We will then travel up through the roots into the xylem structure, which is one of the transport vessel's very important structures. We will look in detail about the structure and the function of the xylem. We will then follow the xylem further up into the leaf structure. In the leaf, water and nutrients can take two pathways. The first pathway leads them out to the atmosphere. This is the stomata. In the stomata, water is lost. It is not lost intentionally, it is lost as a consequence of the plant requiring carbon dioxide for the process of fixing energy. We will then follow the lecture on transpiration. Here we look in detail about how water moves through a plant. We will then go back to the water journey. We said earlier that the water can either travel through the stomata or it can go to the photosynthetic organs. In Lecture 7 we will look at the process of photosynthesis. We will start with the light reaction. The light reaction is where the plant is able to capture energy created from the sun and convert it into chemical energy. Lecture 8 will explain how the plant deals with this chemical energy. Through a number of reactions called the carbon reactions, the chemical energy is converted into energy in the form of sugars. This is useful energy for the plant, as it can be used immediately or it can be transported or translocated through the plant in its various forms. The phloem is the structure that translocates or moves around the sugars, and we will be looking at the structure and the function of this organ. And finally, through the first stage of our journey, we will end back in the roots where we started, and we will look at carbohydrate partitioning, or the storage of energy. In the second stage of this subject, you will learn about how the plant uses the above processes to grow and develop. Lecture 11. How they use nutrients, Lecture 12, and how they control growth and development with sophisticated signals called hormones, Lecture 13. These hormones also aid in defense. This knowledge will be brought together in a concluding lecture where we will introduce to you how plants might respond to changes of future climate conditions, Lecture 14. In this lecture you will have an opportunity to test your understanding of plant physiology. There are 5 learning outcomes for this subject. The first 3 are the most essential and where most emphasis will be applied. These are to investigate and describe how plants function and identify ways in which environmental factors can influence plant physiology and growth. You will learn how to describe and explain the basic terminology of plant morphology, taxonomy and physiology. And you will apply physiological processes of plant growth to plant management of a selected crop, pasture or vineyard. The following slide gives a list of the requirements you will need to complete this subject. The 2 that I suspect will be the most important are access to Moodles, so that you can look at the lecture material and complete the quizzes, and the subject checklist, which you will find at the end of this lecture. There are a number of recommended texts and literature. The prescribed textbook for this subject is the Tays and Zeiger 2010 Plant Physiology 5th edition. We do not recommend that you go out and purchase this, as there are copies in the library that you may borrow. There are also online links to this textbook. Past students have told us that this textbook can be found in other languages, and so far we have heard that it can be found in Chinese and German. In the past, some students have struggled with the Tays and Zeiger recommended textbook. If you are finding that this is the case, a good alternative is the Atwell, Criedemann and Turnbull text written in 1999 on plants in action. Another text you may find useful is the Bell and Hensley 2000 Green Plants, Their Origin and Diversity, or the Hopkins Introduction to Plant Physiology. Stern et al. In 2003 also gives a nice and simple introduction to plant physiology, which may aid in your overall understanding. This subject is accompanied with many online resources. These can be found in your lecture notes, in your tutorial exercises, in your practical books, or you may be given journal articles which are associated with the topics for you to read. We will always identify which journal articles are essential and which are placed there for additional depth and interest. This subject is delivered in a flexible learning format, and as such, time management is essential. It is your responsibility to manage your time accordingly. You should expect to do on average 10 hours study per week for this subject. During these 10 hours, you will watch lectures, conduct your DIY experiments, complete your associated Moodle quizzes, and read the literature recommended with each lecture. Contact hours will include weekly tutorials. These will be discussion-based and will start with discussions on each lecture. Therefore, it is essential that you watch the lecture before you come to the tutorial. After discussions on each lecture, a task may be presented in the tutorial to help with your understanding on the topic. There is a 2-day intensive practical workshop accompanied with this subject. Your attendance is compulsory. The dates that were suggested for this workshop were in week 8, Sunday the 13th, and Monday the 14th of April. These dates have been selected due to the flexible learning format. For some students, this subject may be challenging. It is recommended that in order to pass the subject, you watch all the lectures within the guided timelines, complete all quizzes, and review and repeat where required. Complete all practicals and associated readings. Past students have suggested that planning their time was very useful. Please ensure that you complete lectures 1 to 10 within the first 6 weeks of this subject. You must complete lectures 1 to 10 before the practical workshop sessions commence in week 8. This subject is assessed by 3 methods. The first method is the writing of a plant physiological management plan. This assessment is worth 30% of your marks. You will need to complete and hand in this assessment by the 31st of March in week 6. You will get feedback from this assessment on week 8. The second method of assessments is the practical assessments, and this is worth a total of 30%. The practical assessments will be separated into 2 sections. Part 1, you will hand in a practical book. This practical book will be associated with your practical workshop, which will be conducted on the 13th and the 14th of April. You will hand this practical book in week 9, on the 28th of April. This will give you several weeks to write up your conclusions and to answer the tasks. You will get feedback from Part 1 practical in week 11. Part 2 is the write-up of the carbohydrate partitioning experiment. This is the DIY experiment you have conducted on wheat throughout the semester. This will be handed in week 11 on the 12th of May, and feedback will be handed in back to you by week 13. The final form of assessment is a traditional written exam. This is worth 40% of this subject. This will be given at the end of the semester, during the exam period. Feedback will be provided by your mark, and for some assessments a rubric will be provided. A rubric is a descriptive scoring or marking scheme. This can be used to help you get the best grades. All rubrics are available on Moodle. While the quizzes are not assessed, we do feel that they are a very important part to students being able to test and examine how much they know in this subject. Feedback for the quizzes are instantaneous. That is, as soon as you complete the quiz, you will get the feedback. Look at the questions. Look at what you get wrong and what you get right. If you get a number of questions wrong, go back and revise that part of the lecture. It is recommended that students repeat the quiz until they have obtained 80% or more. The marked practical reports and the plant physiological management plan assessments will be returned within 2 weeks of their hand-in date. If a practical assessment or a management plan assessment is handed in late, or an extension is given for the report, then feedback over a 2-week period from hand-in cannot be guaranteed. The Assessment 1 Plant Physiological Management Plan, which is worth 30%. All the details for this assessment are now on Moodle. You will see these details with the lecture handout. Please note, importantly, a crop needs to be selected for this assessment in order for you to complete it. Each student will have a different crop. Selection will be based on a first-come, first-served. Each student must select a crop only from the list provided. They must contact either Alistair or Nikki to confirm this crop has not been taken. If a student has not selected a crop within the first 2 weeks, one will be selected for them. Please note, the assessment deadline for this task is week 6. In Assessment 2, on the practicals, the details are already uploaded in Moodle. As described previously, there are 2 parts. Part 1 is the completion of the practical book. This needs to be handed in week 9 on the 28th of April. Part 2 is on carbohydrate partitioning experiment. Each student will be provided with some wheat plants at the beginning of this subject. Please contact either myself or Alistair if you do not have your plants. If our students at any time need assistance during this course, there are a number of ways you can get some help. We encourage students to attend the tutorials, and these will be very informal discussions on many of the topics covered in the lectures. There will also be some workshops, and again, the informal nature of these workshops will allow students to discuss the aspects of the course or the lecture contents they may be struggling with. If the tutorial or the workshop format is not appropriate, then please feel free to schedule a time with the lecturers. Please note, both Alistair and myself have a very busy schedule. We are often not to be found in our offices, and we encourage you to please organise a time to visit us via email first. This will save you many wasted trips. Our emails and contact phone numbers are found on the screen, and we do encourage any students who are having problems to contact us early. I will end this lecture with a look at a checklist. The first part of the checklist is all the components that you should have in order to start this subject. The second part of the checklist is a list that should be completed at the end of the subject. This will ensure that you have completed all components of the subject and are ready to sit the exam. In the first instance, it is absolutely essential that you have access to Moodle. Without access to Moodle, and reliable access at that, you will not be able to complete this subject. In Moodle, you will attain all links to lectures, videos, lecture handouts, Moodle quizzes and tutorials. Although we still recommend that you physically come to the timetable tutorials where possible, and if you are doing this subject via the internet and externally, then please ensure that you turn up to the arranged online tutorials. Please ensure that you have details of the DIY practicals and that you are given your week plants. You will also be provided with a practical booklet. And finally, Why Study Plant Physiology document is a document that outlines how this subject will be taught, assessment and assessment criteria, and further details of these assessments. I want to end this lecture by thanking you all for taking part in this subject.